Hello, happy people. I hope you're having a great day today. Today we're going to be taking a look at The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. That's the next thing I read after knocking out the War of the Worlds over a few days. It was kind of split over Thanksgiving holiday. And now I knocked this out over a 3-day period. It's 126 pages long. So it took me, I knocked out about 40-50 pages a day. It took me a little more. Probably like closer to like an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes for each section that I knocked out. So all told, it was probably about 4 hours of my time to read the classic novella by H.G. Wells that puts him on the map in a major way, written in 1895. Like the War of the Worlds, this story was published in a serial format over times. And this was very common for novels during this time. You've got a lot of novels, even Charles Dickens, for example, his stuff, like his famous Christmas story, was a serialized first with newspapers or magazines. And these were key aspects and ways to sell these things during the penny dreadful era or the pulp era. So these are very common things like back-to-back kind of generations. When these two types of media began to sort of dominate the world. So this is a very, very common way of publishing. And then a lot of times what winds up happening is that after the serialization is over, then after you've built up demand, then the novel gets officially published in a hardcover form that people then buy, or sometimes in another form too. For example, I was doing some research on the novella, the Battle of Dorking, by which began sort of this invasion thing. It was also it was a military science fiction short story that sort of began the invasion subgenre. It was published in the 1860s in the UK. After being serialized, and it's kind of more of a novella length. It was then published in a pamphlet rather than a book. And it sold more than 80,000 copies in like just the first week because of how popular and how much it had built up demand. The same thing happened with the previous thing that I reviewed for you, War of the Worlds, where it was serialized first and then it was released in hardcover later. After the demand was there, people wanted to go back and reread it, or maybe they missed the newspaper and magazines where they were published. And so they went back and said, hey, I want to go back and read this because my friends had read it and I've heard all about this. So this is now my chance to get caught up, or just kind of read it in one setting. So this is a very, very common way of publishing a novel during this era, is serialization. And then what you do is you end each chapter, if you will, of the serial with a cliffhanger, much like a movie serial will do the same, sometimes literally. And then that idea is that is the way for them to come back to the next installment, which might be a month later in the next month's magazine, right? So you want to make sure that they're coming out. This is also a good way to get sales if you're a magazine. If you're just publishing short stories, right, there's less of a demand for the newest, latest magazine, right? Because people could still be reading older ones or buying secondhand copies from stores, or just rereading the ones that they've already purchased that they may not have read yet. But the next chapter in a novel that they're following in a magazine. So this is also a popular way to sell things during that era too. Now, The Time Machine put H.G. Wells on the map in a major way. It's his first major work. It was published in a major way. It's kind of an adventure, a serial. The science fiction aspects of it are certainly there. H.G. Wells is the grandfather of modern science fiction, obviously, and so there are some aspects in there. Our time traveler, for example, will talk about traveling in the fourth dimension, which is time, rather than just measuring it, just like, and saying that we move from time to time. And then there's this whole conversation at the beginning that talks about the actual science of time travel before time travel starts, which I think grounds it into more of the science fiction aspects of the story. And he talks with some skeptics and some unbelievers in time travel prior to jump starting the actual travel itself. So there is that sort of a foundation for what's going to wind up happening with the time travel story. Now, one of the things I think is very interesting, it's also something that he did in the War of the Worlds, which is I think, now I've noticed it more, having gone back and reading The Time Machine now for the second time, and the first time since I was in high school, and I think I was a freshman in high school when I first read this. This was my second thing I read by H.G. Wells, and I picked up this copy at a used bookstore in Charleston, West Virginia, where I was living at the time. and I, read it, and I liked it a lot. And I knocked it out after I read The War of the Worlds, which I purchased at a book fair when I was in junior high. I think it was a year prior, when I was in 8th grade, down in southern West Virginia in Boone County. And there was a book fair that came, and I picked up The War of the Worlds, knocked it out, and then I wanted to read something else by the guy. So the next thing I went to was The Time Machine, which is, definitely early on in H.G. Wells' career. And again, this is something I've noticed in both books now, is that almost nobody actually gets a name in these works. For example, in The Time Machine, the person, our protagonist, is called the time traveler. People are given their job like the psychologist, or a description like the very young person. They're rarely actually given a name. In fact, there are only, I think, 2 characters in The Time Machine that actually have names. A major antagonist of the protagonist in the conversations. They talk about how he's just naturally kind of a naysayer, and in the group that's having these conversations and meets each week. And then also his sort of love interest with the future people is also named too, and that's pretty much it. I think if I remember correctly, those are the only 2 characters that are named. Everybody else is just given a title, including our protagonist. The same thing happens in The War of the Worlds. Nobody is named. The curate, who our main character allies with, our main character's wife, whom he chases like his entire pursuit in the novel is to chase his wife, and we never actually get her name. And she's our motivating force, and we don't even have her name for her. It's very interesting that we don't actually get names. And I think it's a very interesting narrative choice by H.G. Wells in these 2 novels that were published in 1895 rather, and 97, almost 2 years apart, and were both huge hits by Wells and really put them on the map in a major way, although The Time Machine did that more so. And I think it's a very interesting narrative choice by Wells to not name characters. I think it has 2 effects. One is it really doesn't personalize the story, but then I think it also helps to keep the story from being overly in of its time, right? If they've been named, if the wife, for example, had been named something like a common name of the 1890s, that name might not be common anymore, right? And so, it might therefore be, my grandmother's name was Thelma. Well, Thelma's not a very common name anymore. It was common when she was born, in the early 1900s, but giving her a name like Thelma might help to keep you in that time, whereas without a name, it's more timeless, if that makes sense. So I think that there are some strengths and weaknesses to that narrative choice that he also does in this novel too, and having read them literally back to back in the same week, in 4 days and 3 days. Therefore, I have a much a stronger view of this narrative choice. And I remember going through and reading all the short stories in a previous collection and in previous reviews for you, where I've reviewed select versions from those short stories by Wells. And one of the things I think is very interesting that's happening here is that I don't remember this being the case in a lot of those short stories that I've read back to back. For example, the one that's set in Mars, that's oftentimes viewed as in the same world that I reviewed for you. If I remember, the shopkeeper's named, the family's named, right? All of our protagonists are named, and that short story. So that has happened out there. So I don't think this is something he continues as a personal affectation. I think this is really just these 2 novels. It's a particular characterization of them. So I think it's interesting. I wanted to mention it up front. Now, it's hard to have a review for The Time Machine that's not something that somebody already has, right? This is a classic of science fiction literature. Arguably, the key piece that puts science fiction on the map. H.G. Wells wrote for the masses. He did not write for the aristocracy. He used the language of the day. His stuff is not hard to read, even 100 plus years later. In this case, 100 and almost 30 years later. So it's not hard to read. It might take a little more time, but that's, but I told you, it's like a 4-hour read for 126 pages. I don't think it's particularly out there. I read War of the Worlds in 6 hours, and I finished that up. So again, I think this is a particularly strong story. It's heavily influential. So it's hard to have a unique and hot take on something that's been as reviewed as The Time Machine and has been as hugely influential as The Time Machine. And, pretty much everybody's read it. So I don't come to this saying, oh, I had this cool and interesting take on it. Like I would have had with something like something that's more unique that by H.G. Wells from his short story collection that's rarely reviewed or read that I might be bringing to your attention for the first time. If you're new to this channel because this is a big name novel and this is not something new to you, this channel regularly and typically reviews either two types of pieces, either pieces from older times that we have forgotten about by forgotten authors that were just as good as authors that we've remembered, or lesser known works by famous authors that we may not know about or have heard about. I've done that with Geet 'em Up with some of his horror stuff. I've done that with H.G. Wells' science fiction stuff and his short story collection. I've done that with famous writers that might be famous for one or two short stories like Saki. And I've done a deep dive into Saki, the horror writer. I've done, some lesser known stories by H.P. Lovecraft. I've taken a look at Lord Dunsany, done a deep dive into him, and so forth. And you'll see me continue this theme with a lot of things. So if you're new to this channel, because this is such a big thing, that's kind of the key core structure narratively of where we're going. But sometimes, I'm going back and reading a classic short story or rereading it. I just finished The Chronicles of Narnia, and I'm still publishing those. As I've done this, I've published 5 of those 6, of 7, although I've already recorded them all, a month and a half ago. So I still will take deep dives into famous stuff for the first time, or for the first time as an adult, having gone back to it, or rereading it afresh, or classics in that I've never read. That, for example, I'd never read Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. I read it for this short story. I read it for this channel rather. So this is definitely something that's a passion of mine, to sometimes take a look at these classics that we might have forgotten about or may have influenced us, but we've never heard about, or we've never actually read about, but we've heard about. So there's a lot of these. But basically the two main things that I do are either, lesser known works by big name writers or forgotten writers that are just as good as the big stuff that we still remember. And so that's sort of my passion for this channel. But this, again, I'm going back to this. It's kind of classified as a novella. It's just 120 pages long. A lot of older novels aren't that long. I mean, War in the Worlds is a full-fledged novel. It's only like 80 pages longer than this. So, it's fine. There's no issues here and so forth. I'm sure you're familiar with the plot of The Time Machine. I've already talked a little bit about the first chapter. So I won't spend that much time going in deep dive. When I do a review of a novel, even a novel that everybody's read, I don't do a spoiler review in case you haven't. But there you are. That's my review of The Time Machine. If you're interested in I'm going to be giving this, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. It's a classic work, but it's not the classic that The War of the Worlds is. Even H.G. Wells himself said that this was more of it feels like coming back to this as an adult, and he wrote a prelude to the reprinting of this. He says in it that it's more of it feels like an amateur attempt to write something serious. And he's become much more of a serious writer. And I definitely agree. It feels a little long at times. There's a lot of description in this 126 pages and less plot in this 126 pages, which I think is a weakness too. The War of the Worlds is tight. I give it a 9 out of 10. It is a tightly done stuff. There's a lot less descriptions, a lot more things happening. There's still some descriptions. It's good stuff, well written, but it's not to the detriment of the plot. There's a lot of stuff that happens in that novel. There's a lot less stuff that happens. Now, admittedly, it's 80 pages shorter, so there should be like 80 pages less of stuff, but it doesn't feel like it's that percentage. Like there's a lot less stuff that actually happens. there's not a lot of actual plot that happens. It's just more talking about the science and the context and the concept, and then what actually happens, and then you get what he thinks about what's happening. So you read the narrator's thoughts that he's telling to these people, and then after he is proven wrong, then we'll read like 5 or 6 pages more about now what the the narrator thinks, and it just feels a little long at times. And I think that he could have cut like 20 pages from this and made it a stronger narrative choice. And even H.G. Wells says this is an amateur attempt at a serious topic. This is one of the first things that he wrote and published. So again, even he says that in the prelude to a republishing of this in the 30s, almost 40 years later. So even Wells himself says there are some weaknesses to this structure, and I agree. It's a classic. You should read it. It's definitely worth your time. And I'll link you to 2 links below. I'll link you to this for free online. I'm sure it's on Project Gutenberg. And then I'll also try to link you to a novel that you can purchase and read for those people like me who prefer to read it in a handwritten, sort of a traditional, old school form on Amazon. So I'll try to link you to both, and for whatever you're interested in, or if you just want to buy it on an e-reader, that's fine too. There's no judgment here. Read it however you want. You have so many options today that there's really I have no issues, no skin in the game. Nobody's paying me for anything, right? So anyway, but this is definitely worth your 4 hours of your time for you to knock out this classic. It's got a lot of fun things to say. And it's definitely a classic of the genre that is heavily influenced the modern science fiction, created the time machine and so forth, in ways that I could not ever begin to talk about in a shorter review like this. So have you read The Time Machine? If so, what'd you think about it? Did you agree or disagree with my 8 out of 10 review? I would be more than happy to engage you with it further in the comments below, whatever your take is. Or if you want to talk about some of the spoilers that I didn't talk about, because keep my review spoiler free. If you liked this review, please feel encouraged to hit that subscribe button. There's going to be a lot more of these to follow. And then finally, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day and investing it and watching my video. We all have so many things that are happening in our lives, and we're pulled in so many different directions. So the fact that you spent this time with me is incredibly humbling. I appreciate it. So thanks again, and have an amazing day.